I want to speak now to the children, boys and girls. We're thinking in these weeks about Jesus, and one of the things that John wants us to see is that Jesus is the great King. But that's not just something John wants us to see, that's the storyline of the whole Bible, and that's what I want us to think about over our children's addresses for the next number of weeks. I want us to think about the story of the King, for that's the story of the whole Bible. The Bible, how does it start off? Well, think away back to Genesis. It starts off with God creating the world. And God creates this entire planet and the sun and the moon and the stars and all the galaxies. And he creates everything in it. He creates the lions, the tigers, he creates the dinosaurs, he creates the eagles and the robins, he creates the butterflies, he creates the great creatures of the sea, the dolphins and the whales. He creates the trees and the fruits and the fields and the crops and the mountains. He creates every single thing. And you know what that makes God? That makes God the King of everything. So there's our little world, and there's a crown over it to remind us that it's God's world and that he's king over everything. But what came next? Well, God made Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve were to live in God's world, but they weren't to do their own thing. They were to live with God as king and to enjoy God's kindly rule over everything. And you remember what God did? God gave them one little test to prove that he was their king and that they would obey him as their king. He put many trees in the Garden of Eden, and he said, you can eat from all of these trees. Eat from any of them and as much as you want and as often as you like. But he said, there is one tree, only one, from which you're not to eat. I want you to obey me in this. If they would obey him, they would be showing that they were living with God as their king. Do you think that's what Adam and Eve did? No, the fruit that was on the tree, Adam and Eve took, and when they took that, they stopped. Do you see what's happened to the crown? They stopped obeying God as their king. And they said, we want to be kings and queens ourselves. We want to do things our way. And do you think everything stayed good and beautiful the way God had made it? I know everything started to go downhill at that point. And that's where we're going to leave the story of the King. And that helps us to understand why God tells us to obey him. We see that if when we disobey him, we're saying, no, you can't be king. God, you're not in charge. When we disobey those that God has put in charge of us, our mums and our dads, we're saying the same, no, God, you were wrong. And we see here that disobedience always makes a mess. And when we do things our way, it makes a big mess. And so, boys and girls, we are called to obey God, and to live with God as our King. And our problem is that we can't do that, and we're going to need God to help us to take the crown off our own heads and to change our hearts so that we will follow him as our King. And that's what Jesus comes to do. That's why we need to ask Jesus to be our King, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. But I want you to remember, this is how the Bible starts. God is the King of everything, and everything works best when we live knowing that God is King and we have him as our King.